So what I'd like to do next is to move into a discussion of the great Pharaoh Akhenaten, who ruled in Egypt during its New Kingdom period right around 1350 BC, and he ruled for about 17 years. What happened was, after the Middle Kingdom, the Hyksos came in, and they come into Egypt. They are a group of mixed Indo-Aryan as well as Semitic peoples with a mounted two-wheeled horse chariot and the compound bow and arrow. They come in and they conquer Egypt, and they set up a capital in the north at Avaris. And they ruled there for about a century and a half. And some of them actually have biblical names that actually do turn up in the Old Testament. So they may be affiliated with the Hebrews. There's some debate about that. But in any event, they are expelled around shortly before 1500 BC. They're expelled by the brothers Amoza and Kamoza. They expel the Hyksos. And these men are from Thebes in the south. It was in the Middle Kingdom that Egypt had shifted from its central capital of Memphis to Thebes in the south, and the primary god of Thebes is, of course, Amun, who will play a role here, as we'll see in a moment. And so we get to the period of the New Kingdom, which is the beginnings of the creation of Egypt's universal state period, especially under the name of a character named Thutmose I, who begins to expand the empire into Palestine, and Thutmose III, who is really the Caesar figure, who creates a gigantic empire in Palestine long about 1500 BC, and they are stopped by the Hittites. The empire covers all of Palestine and goes up to about where the Hittites are, who challenge them, and that's the extent of the empire. In response to this Hyksos invasion, all of this takes place in the same way that the United States today has gone to war, largely in the Middle East as a response, creating its own sort of Middle Eastern empire now in response to 9/11. Something similar to that was going on. Now, it's in the reign of Thutmose I that the first of the so-called books of the Netherworld begin to start appearing on the walls of the rock-cut tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Now, whereas we've seen the evolution of the pyramids, and there were more pyramids during the Middle Kingdom, but there are no pyramids really in the New Kingdom. Instead, all the kings are buried in a single large mountain, and the mountain itself in the Valley of the Kings is itself a single sort of giant natural pyramid. So they don't build separate pyramids. Instead, they burrow into this mountain, and they put beautiful rock-cut tombs on the insides of these mountains, and they begin painting the books of the afterlife, the books of the netherworld, on the walls of these tombs, starting at about 1500 BC. And in the book of the first of these is called the Amduat, or the Book of What is in the Underworld, and it depicts the journey of Re on his solar barge through the various hours of the night until he gets to the 6th hour of the night, where he goes down into the underworld and meets Osiris on his throne, from whence he is regenerated. His contact with Osiris regenerates him. And then on his way out, he has people on the boat such as Set and the scorpion goddess Selket slay the Apophis serpent for him, and then he is reborn in the morning as the sun god or the dawn god Khepri, the beetle god. So this god is known as Re-Harakti, and he is the god, as we have already seen, of the 4th and 5th dynasties, the great Re god, who is the primary god of Akhenaten. And he has 4 different modes. Prior to Akhenaten's reign, Egyptian religion was fanaticentric, and it was centered around this image of the birth of Re in the morning as Khepri. At noon, he was simply known as Re, of whom the word Atun, A-T-E-N, Atun, is the visible solar disk. And then in the evening, when the sun sets, Re becomes Atum, A-T-U-M, which is a much older god that goes back to the pyramid texts as the setting sun. And then at midnight, he becomes identified with Osiris. So spatially configured, we can think of the fanaticentric nature of Egyptian cosmology as going around the clock in that manner, with Re-Harakti being the central figure there in that cosmology. Now, Akhenaten himself, his original name was Amenophis IV. His father was Amenophis III, so he's named after Amun. But he was raised, apparently, in his childhood. Akhenaten lived in the north. He may have served for a time as a priest of the god Ptah in the city of Heliopolis. but he stayed for a time in the north and visited places like Heliopolis and Memphis, where he regarded Re-Harakti, this god whose life cycle we've just talked about, as the original authentic god. And of course it was the case during the 4th and the 5th dynasties, and in the 5th dynasty, the great solar temples, the great sun temples with their obelisks, and an obelisk is basically just a frozen beam of sunlight, were celebrations of the god Re, whom it is possible that for one reason or another, we're not sure why, Akhenaten regarded the god Amun as the usurper, as the inauthentic god who came in during later traditions. And Amun is known as the hidden one. Amun is a god of war, and he is also linked in his mode as Amun-Min with a fertility god, but he's a god of war and he's regarded as the hidden one. And Akhenaten took a disliking to this god and regarded his traditions as inauthentic. And what Akhenaten wanted to do was to go back and restore the original idea of Re-Harakti, whose visible mode is the Atun disk. Atun is simply Re in one of his modes, namely his mode at noon, as the visible apotheosis of the sun, Atun. So Atun really is the god Re in disguise, and he regarded this as the authentic god, and he wanted to get rid of the Amun cults. And so it started this way with an attempt to, basically what Akhenaten ends up doing, as Franz Borkenau puts it in his essay on the antinomies of the mortuary cycle, is to make war on the astral cults. Eventually what will happen in setting up his solar cult of Re, he will go to war against the astral cults of Egypt. Now remember that Borkenau had said that both Egypt and Mesopotamia began as death-transcending civilizations, which is a point that I modified to say that with Mesopotamia, actually the case was that it began as a death-accepting civilization and then transformed about midway through its life cycle into a death-transcending civilization with the royal tombs of Ur, whereas Egypt begins as a death-transcending civilization, as Borkenau says, and then with Akhenaten, at least during his 17-year reign, it becomes a death-accepting civilization, and Akhenaten begins to nihilistically sterilize, break down, and wipe out all the astral cults, all the mortuary cults. Akhenaten goes to war against the astral plane. And in this respect, he is not just the West's first monotheist, he is the West's first religious fanatic. And in this sense, he is the prototype for everything for the kinds of religious fanatics that we've seen in the West ever since, characters like King Josiah in the biblical tradition, or Theodosius the Great, who in 390 AD anathematized and forcibly had shut down all the pagan traditions and holidays. And so Akhenaten wanted to, he really opens up the tradition for what will be the second generation of civilization that begins with the Jews on the one hand and the Greeks on the other for Borkenau, both of which represent death-accepting civilizations in that they have no interest in the afterlife. The afterlife is a secondary thing and is no longer the main emphasis. You can already see this, according to Borkenau, coming in with Akhenaten, who begins to make the transition. He says basically Moses and Homer carry on Akhenaten's war against the astral plane. And indeed, that is basically what happens. And we can see this in the sense in which Julian Jaynes in the Origins and Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind talks about the stabilization of the ego, gradually part of the reason why in the West the ego came into being and stabilized the way that it did, and it's eventually apotheosized in the metaphysical age from Descartes to Husserl as the transcendental ego, was precisely by going to war against the astral plane, by sealing itself off metaphysically and immunologically into a closed microsphere and going to war against the astral plane and shutting it out and anathematizing it. And Akhenaten is already not just pointing the way to the axial age, but he's also pointing the way to the coming of the ego in the West as a stable entity that is no longer, as Thomas Mann said, open from behind. It's closed now and is no longer permeable and leaky, as it has become once again. It is now today a permeable and leaky vessel which is subject to astral invasion. So this is how Akhenaten starts, and when he is elevated to the throne, by the third year of his reign, he's still reigning in Thebes at Karnak, but in the third year of his reign, he unveils his, what I would call his truth event, drawing an analogy here to Heidegger with his idea of an Abbau, a deconstruction whereby you unconceal something that was original and authentic, you bring it out into the open region of a culture, and you unconceal it and pull it out of by removing centuries of occlusion and error and fallacy to make this original authentic thing, which for Heidegger was the pre-Socratic understanding of being. He brings that back by doing an Abbau in Western philosophy and deconstructing it and wiping it clean of all of its cliches and assumptions about being and its forgetting of being. So too with Akhenaten, he believed that being had been forgotten, being, in this case, being the cult of Re Harakti, or the Atun god. And he wants to bring it back and get rid of the centuries of occlusion of the cult of Amun, and especially also the astral cults of Osiris and Ptah and Sokar and all of the other astral deities that he regarded as some. And remember originally that we saw here in the Fourth Dynasty, with the solar cults coming into being in the Fourth Dynasty, when the pyramids under Snefru began to shift to an axial orientation to the eastern horizon and to the sun, it was precisely a war against the Osirian cults of the dark nighttime dynasties of the first three dynasties of Egypt that the Re cult was built on as something that was completely anathema to them. And Akhenaten wants to restore that war against the astral plane, or at least against the Osiris cults that went on in the Fourth Dynasty. So by the third year of his reign, and the interesting thing is, note too there that Akhenaten sees himself, Akhenaten wasn't an innovator. We tend to see him as an innovator. He saw himself as a conservator, as somebody going back, conserving original culture forms that he felt had been forgotten, covered up, or violated. So he saw himself as a conservator. This is an ancestral cult society, and even Akhenaten's act of going to war against the cult of the dead is still itself an act based on conserving ancestral culture forms. So we still see the ancestor-dominant nature of Egyptian society still present. It's heavy conservatism, even in the acts of a revolutionary and rebel such as Akhenaten. So he saw himself as a conservator. So the truth event whereby he unveiled this to everyone took place in the third year of his reign during the Sed festival at Karnak in Thebes, when he unveiled his so-called Gemp Atun temple. This was a temple that he had built in which he put himself and his wife Nefertiti in as statues, and they were placed in niches along this temple, him and his wife alternating back and forth with the crowns of the air god Shu and Tefnut. Shu and Tefnut were the offspring primordially of Atum. Atum was an original god who was identified with Re Harakti, as we have seen, as the god of the setting sun. Was a god who in the beginning masturbated, and from his semen sprang Shu and Tefnut. Shu is the god of the air and moisture, and Tefnut is the goddess of earthly moisture. She is the equivalent of earthly moisture. And so he plugs himself by putting the crown of Shu on his head and the crown of Tefnut on Nefertiti's head in these statues. He is at this time plugging both himself and Nefertiti into the roles of Shu and Tefnut. And Atum is there by implication of his identification with Atun, with the sun disk. So note that when he does this truth event and he begins to unveil his newfound religion, he does so in such a way that it is still it's not yet monotheistic, it's still polytheistic. Other deities are still in the picture here. It's not just a strict monotheism. And it's also at this temple for the first time that he unveils this brand new art style, which shows him in this absurdly elongated set of canon of proportions, where his head looks pinched and thin as though he were like a Giacometti sculpture. And it was originally thought by excavators when they dug this stuff up that Akhenaten must have been this man who had a disease. But it turns out that if you look at early statues of Akhenaten, such there's a yellow limestone statue of him in the Louvre from before the period of the Gempatun Temple. He has normal proportions. He wasn't deformed in the slightest. There was nothing wrong with him at all. Instead, what he was doing, as Arthur Weigel showed in his original biography of Akhenaten, was that he was going back to a pre-dynastic canon, a pre-dynastic aesthetic canon of Egyptian cultural forms, which he must have unearthed when he was living as a child in the north, in which, in the early canon of these small ivory figurines, they were indeed elongated. If you look at Neolithic Egyptian figurines, they're tall, thin, and elongated, and he would have seen some of these figurines, and they became the canon for him to go back to. So he's going back politically to the Fourth Dynasty, but aesthetically to the pre-dynastic art style. And so he's unveiling that at the Gempatun Temple in the third year of his reign, and identifying him and his wife with Shu and Tefnut. Now, it's in the fifth year of his reign that he changes his name from Amenophis IV, which means Amun is satisfied, to Akhenaten, which means he who serves the will of the Atun. And it's long about this time, in the 5th year of the reign, that he leaves the city of Thebes. He becomes disgusted with it. We don't know why. Some event, possibly an assassination attempt, took place, but whatever it was, it disgusted him, and he decided to leave the city and go downriver, which is to say up north, about 250 miles up north, closer, note, to the north. The north was the ancient sacred holy land of the old kingdom, the old dynasty, and founds on virgin soil a brand new city there on virgin soil. And this is, of course, the world's first utopian city, the city of Akhenaten, a total social experiment here. And the main point about it is that it was founded on virgin soil. Nothing there had existed, maybe except for a small fishing village. But at this location, the cliffs curved away from the land, leaving a lowland area about 8 miles long by 3 miles wide, and creating a natural bay in the desert area. And there was an interesting, though, at the site, and I think the reason he chose this site, is that there was an interesting cleft in the rocks along the cliffs bordering the site, a cleft that mimics, of course, the architectural arrangement of the 2 pylons of the temples at Thebes, which are meant to represent the twin mountains between which the sun is pictured as rising. Just as in the Gilgamesh epic, the sun rises between the Mashu mountains, the twin mountains where the 2 scorpion people were. So too here, in Egypt, the sun is depicted as rising between these 2 pylons. And this cleft in the rocks to the east, where the sun rises, was interesting to Akhenaten, and he decided to build the city there. And not only did he build the city there, but he had his royal tomb built at the cleft in the rock, as well as the cemetery for the nobles there, built in that area, which was an innovation insofar as it lifted the cemetery from the west bank, which was the tradition to put it on the west bank, which was where the setting sun went, and now to put it on the east bank, so that the dead are regarded as being resurrected not by the astral powers of the funerary deities, but they are resurrected by the power of the Atun, the rising sun disk, which as it rises in Akhenaten's cosmology, and he is really the first example in history that we have of a state religion that's founded by a single individual. When the sun rises, it resurrects the dead. They actually wake up in the morning, they come out of the cleft in the rocks, and they mill about. They're thought to mill about invisibly, receiving offerings from the temples. And Akhenaten leaves all the roofs off of all the temples. None of the temples have roofs on them, so that the great sun disk can be seen shining directly down onto all of this. And so this is a city, it's basically a city of light. It's a 2-dimensional city without shadows, without depth. There are no tall buildings in it. The tallest building is the great pylon, the great temple to Atun. They are still mummifying the dead. They are still equipping them with grave gear such as shubtis and canopic chests. But the inscriptions, though, on these objects are carefully modified to give all praise to Atun and no praise whatsoever to Amun or any of the other funerary deities, which are now becoming anathematized. So sunlight soaks the city everywhere, banishing all the shadows. And there's no need for a judgment of the dead here, since everyone's on trial all the time. There's nowhere to hide in this city from the burning gaze of the sun disk of Atun. You can't escape it. And the buildings compose this vast field of squares and rectangles. The structures are all built out of mud brick cased with limestone, upon which bright multicolored reliefs of the sun disk and the royal family are portrayed. Some of the buildings are equipped with balustrades of alabaster and granite and hard limestone. There's a lot of open space with large roofless corridors, long expansive courtyards, and there's a long central lane going right up the center of the city that was a very wide lane down which Akhenaten rode in his 2-wheeled chariot. He went everywhere in this 2-wheeled chariot, and the city was specifically designed to take 2-wheeled chariots into account as its central axis. And he's the first pharaoh, actually, who's depicted in the art riding in these chariots for other than military purposes. So he was quite fascinated with this new form of transportation. And this road was about 30 feet wide, so it was very wide, and it was the central means of conveyance through the city. And the city, basically, it had no urban proletariat. There were no poor people in the city. All the slaves lived, they didn't have separate houses, they all lived with their masters. So there was no room for an urban proletariat to take root, and there were no poor people. Akhenaten's religion was a religion of absolute beneficence. It was a shallow, sort of artificial religion in which evil is not accounted for because there are no shadows anywhere. We're only simply getting the Apollonian side of the world minus the Dionysian side. It's Vishnu without Shiva in Hindu cosmology. There are no shadows, no depths, and consequently there is no evil either. The problem of evil did not exist for Akhenaten, since the god Atun provides for the welfare of men, and no evil could come from him. If evil existed, it would be regarded as a defect of the sun god Atun. This is possibly also the reason why he let the empire in Palestine disintegrate on his watch. The Atun was not a god that sanctioned war, and so he was not interested in war, and he was not interested in going to war or bloodshed. However, this does not mean that a police state atmosphere did not exist during his reign. It most certainly did. Long about the year 9 of his reign, he began to send armies of men, soldiers, and his soldiers were mostly Nubians and Asiatics. They were sent out through the city to chisel out the occurrence of the plural word for gods. Gods, plural, was chiseled out everywhere. The name of Amun, the names of Ptah and Horus and Sokar and Hathor, they were all anathematized, and these armies of priests and priests of Akhenaten, as well as soldiers, went across the land, and a police state atmosphere began to prevail. And anyone who had any little kind of, let's say, cosmetic makeup boxes or anything that had the names of any other gods on them, we find evidence of them carefully and rather frantically being erased, lest anyone be found in possession of something that had the name of the god Amun inscribed upon it. That was anathema. So there was a kind of a police state atmosphere under his reign here from about the year 9 and 10 of his reign, and an atmosphere of real intolerance, at which time his religion now becomes sternly and fanatically monotheistic. And even the gods Shu and Tefnut, their names disappear from his name, which is now just Atun, and it's stripped down to Atun. And so, long about the year 12, the 12th year of his reign, then disaster slowly starts to seep its way in. A plague was loose in the land, and this plague seems to have killed off his mother, Queen Tai, as well as his beloved wife, Kia, and an 11-year-old daughter, one of his favorites named Mekhet-Atun, who also died. It had been thought that his wife, Nefertiti, was also killed during this plague, because her name disappears from the records at about this time, and the name of somebody else named Smenkhare begins to appear as a co-regent of Akhenaten's. But it turns out, it looks like Nefertiti was Smenkhare. She, after all, is depicted on a relief sculpture with him, where the two are depicted together and each have 2 cartouches. But if only the pharaoh is allowed 2 cartouches, his consort would have had 1. But clearly here she was regarded as a co-regent. Also, the nicknames for both Smenkhare and Nefertiti were the same, Nefer-Nefru-Atun. So clearly they were the same individual. So he elevated Nefertiti to the status of co-ruler along with him. But the state was also running out of money because Akhenaten was letting the empire in Palestine go to rot, while the so-called Habiru and the Amorites were out there running around, causing pillaging and devastation. And possibly these Habiru were, as Freud says in Moses and Monotheism, or actually he denies that the Habiru were Hebrews, but Joseph Campbell points out that the Habiru most likely were Hebrews running around Palestine at this time, sending Tel el Amarna letters, the so-called Amarna letters, which went largely unheeded by him. He was uninterested in them. But the result of that was that tribute money stopped coming in from Palestine, and so they started running out of money. The shutting down of the Theban priesthood also cut off a significant source of revenue, and so things began to get rather desperate and dire here. Akhenaten then dies in the year 17 of his reign, and we're not sure how. I suspect that it was from depression. Nefertiti and Smenkhare ruled another year, and then she too drops from the records. She ruled for about a year or so without him, and her desperation is indicated by the fact that she sent a letter to the Hittite king asking the Hittite king to send her one of his sons to marry her because she was afraid of marrying anyone around her. There might be a conspiracy or an assassination plot. And the Hittite king was suspicious, but he did send his son, and unfortunately the son was assassinated en route somewhere in Palestine, so he never made it. But that indicates the level of the desperation that was going on here. And then, so after Nefertiti dies, the boy king Tutankhamun steps up to the throne at the age of 9. Now, Tutankhamun, recent genetic studies have shown that Tutankhamun was definitely the son, genetically, of Akhenaten by one of his sisters. We don't know which sister. And the old theory that Tutankhamun was killed by a blow to the back of the skull has now been debunked. Apparently the hole in his skull was made during the mortuary practice. He was a sickly child. He kept getting malaria, and he had a club foot, so there were some genetic problems, perhaps from incest, who knows. But he would have ruled under the advice of a man named I, whose name is spelled A-Y, was the charioteer under Akhenaten, the master charioteer, and he was the advisor. He advised Tutankhamun to leave the city of Akhenaten. They left it behind and they went back to Thebes, but both I and Tutankhamun tried to fly a middle ground, and while admitting the other gods back into the pantheon and the Amun priesthood, they also wanted to keep Atun in the picture. And so you find the famous sun disk where the rays end in hands on the back of Tutankhamun's throne chair in his tomb. So they tried to keep Atun still in the picture. But when Tutankhamun died, his reign was taken over by I, and then when I died, his reign was taken over by a war general named Horemhab. And Horemhab was a war general who had been trying to rebuild the empire back in Palestine. Some of it is reclaimed, but not the whole thing. It never was what it was under the time of Thutmose III. And Horemhab was a man who decided that the cult of Atun had to be completely wiped out of existence. So the city of Akhenaten now, which was becoming a ghost city, we have evidence that the city was abandoned very quickly. A lot of animals were left behind to starve to death. And so it was abandoned very quickly, but Horemhab sent an army back to completely destroy the city, dismantle it brick by brick, take the bricks and rebuild them into the pylons at the city of Thebes. Fortunately for later archaeologists, because we've been able to reconstruct Akhenaten from those bricks that Horemhab had preserved. And notice that he reverses, in doing so, he reverses Akhenaten's truth event, whereas Akhenaten had unconcealed, he had pulled out of concealment the Re cult, the Atun cult. Horemhab reverses it and conceals it back, puts it back into memory. The city is wiped out, and in the future, Akhenaten's name is struck from all the king's lists, and all the people associated with his dynasty were also struck from the king's lists as though they had never been. The Egyptians tried to rewrite their history by rewriting it without any mention of Akhenaten in it, and they edited him out of their history, because as we have seen in the last time, he was guilty of, in the last discussion, he was guilty of departing from Mot. And this erasure of his name from records is a kind of symbolic equivalent of when the heart in the judgment of the dead is heavier than the feather, it's swallowed up into oblivion by the swallower. And so that's what they did. They punished Akhenaten for departing from Mot. And he was regarded by them as departing from Mot by instituting this religion, this war against the astral plane, although he himself saw himself as following the way of Mot, going the right way, by performing an authentic act of conservation whereby he unconcealed, brought out into the open clearing of the culture an act of unconcealment whereby the original understanding of being as Atun, as Re Harakti Atun, was brought back into the fold. He saw himself as doing something that was right in the eyes of Mot, but later tradition anathematized him. But Egyptian society, I'm afraid, never did recover from the nihilism and the destabilizations and the crumbling of the empire that went on in the reign of Akhenaten. And so it's from this point on that Egypt slowly begins to go downhill as a civilization, and it never really does recover its former glory. Pretty soon it will be invaded by the sea peoples under Ramses III, and they will barely survive through the Mediterranean Dark Age that will then lead to the coming of the Greeks. But next, what I want to do is go back and look at the Indus Valley on the other side of the Persian Gulf and continue there from where we left off. We'll see what would have happened if Gilgamesh had kept journeying south past the island of Bahrain. We'll see what else he would have encountered in the Persian Gulf if he had traveled on his way to Meluhha. Nikos Kazantzakis, his sequel to the Odyssey, has him traveling in the other direction, going toward the Minoans, but we'll imagine him traveling down the Persian Gulf next.